That was a Ukrainian fisherman hitting a Russian drone with a fish. And this is a laser targeting system being developed by Raytheon to counter threats from FPV drones. They've become the latest pawn in an ever-evolving back and forward of innovation on the battlegrounds of Ukraine, and the defences range from the sublime to the ridiculous, and everything in between. We're here to talk about the creative methods being developed to counter this new threat from above, but it's not exactly a new threat. The earliest developments of what would come to be known as drones might surprise you. The origins can be traced back to Tesla. Not that Tesla, this Tesla. Let me take you back to the 10th of July, 1856. It's a stormy night in Smiljan, a small village in what would eventually become Croatia. Being born is a baby that would go on to revolutionize how we power the world. But something Nikola Tesla is less known for is his early work on remotely operated devices. In 1898, he was able to demonstrate remote operation of an unmanned torpedo boat that could carry an explosive charge and be directed by radio waves. Like many innovations, it came during an arms race, this one between the great naval powers of the time. As for UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, well, they were being tested by the UK and USA as far back as World War I. The same war that saw the once powerful cavalry charge ushered out of doctrine was also privy to the early developments of unmanned aircraft, albeit silently and many miles from the battlefield. The technological wheels, or wings, were by now firmly in motion for the development of the weapon that would become synonymous with the war in Ukraine. The first drones to dominate the headlines were Turkish-made Baykar. The Ukrainians used them in the early days of the invasion to target Russian hardware across the front lines. They hit trains, tanks, anti-air platforms, and even ships. They were able to do this by exploiting gaps in Russian air defense, devastating both Russian morale and supply chains. They were so effective, both militarily and from a propaganda standpoint, a viral folk song swept the internet. But then, they went silent. Russia had adapted. They did this by deploying more and more electronic warfare devices, jamming Ukraine's communications and their ability to deploy and navigate Baykar drones. The Russian front, RUSI estimates, is now covered by approximately one major electronic warfare system per 10 kilometers of front, and you'll usually find them about 7 kilometers from the front line. This complex, chess-like back and forward has been a mainstay of the conflict, with the successful jamming of Baykars retiring the expensive drones to surveillance roles, out of reach of Russian air defense. The next move in drone chess was backwards. Rather than deploy more technologically advanced drones, both Russia and Ukraine looked to cheap commercial drones as alternatives. The same kind you and I have been able to buy online for years. Videos of grenades being dropped from off-the-shelf consumer drones began flooding the internet. Adapted by frontline units and volunteers alike to carry and drop explosives, these drones are harder to detect by traditional anti-air systems, and with a skilled user can take out anything from troops to weapons caches to heavily armoured vehicles. And then came a sound that will traumatize soldiers from both sides for years to come. The FPV drone, originally intended for racing, was now one of the most feared assets on the battlefield. They can swoop, they can dive, and they're almost impossible to shoot down. And their numbers increasing. Ukraine has announced it will buy 4.5 million first-person view drones in 2025. 4.5 million, that's triple last year's amount. Russia is investing just as heavily. Defense against this type of drone can be broken down into 4 main categories. First up is physical protection. That's nets, cages, camouflage, and cover and concealment. The second we've already touched on, electronic warfare. That's jamming, spoofing, and cyber warfare. The third is kinetic countermeasures. That's anti-aircraft systems, drone interceptors, yes, drone-on-drone fights in the sky, and directed energy weapons, or lasers. And the fourth is tactical considerations. The advent of FPV drones has ripped up the handbook for military training across the world. They're having to revise situational awareness, movement and maneuvering, and coordination and communication, as well as training and education. And if all of that fails, you just throw whatever you have at it. This scrapbook, taken from a fallen North Korean soldier in the Kursk region, gives an insight into their training. Basically, use your comrade as bait and shoot. As most of our own devices are increasingly becoming wireless, drones are taking another apparent step back to move forward. Increasingly, to avoid jamming capabilities on both sides, we're seeing the use of drones controlled by fiber-optic cables. Spools of wire miles long are able to direct drones to their targets without the risk of being brought down by enemy electronic warfare systems. They're comparatively expensive and reportedly require a greater level of skill to operate, but this development has allowed Ukraine and Russia to bypass years of innovation on increasingly complex jamming systems. But it's not quite checkmate. This Ukrainian unit was observed following the trail of a fiber-optic cable back to its operator and assaulting. We went from cavalry, steam and coal to unmanned drones striking positions miles away. And the future is looking even more reliant on drones, with advances in AI and autonomy tipped to be the next development to have generals across the world scratching their heads. All this is a far cry from the prediction of Nikola Tesla as he first tested his radio-controlled torpedo boat. At the time, he prophesied, "War will cease to be possible when all the world knows tomorrow that the most feeble of nations can supply itself immediately with a weapon which will render its coast secure and its ports impregnable to the assaults of the united armadas of the world. Battleships will cease to be built, and the mightiest armorclads and the most tremendous artillery afloat will be of no more use than so much scrap iron. But I have no desire that my fame should rest on the invention of a merely destructive device, no matter how terrible. I prefer to be remembered as the inventor who succeeded in abolishing war." Well, Mr. Tesla, this is awkward. Joe Cowan for BFBS Forces News.